Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. Yeah, I don't actually have anything to say. I make carrot cake and it tastes really nice. Okay, on with the show. Chapter 3, A Conflict. The day following this happy intellectual arrangement, Cecilia was visited by Mr. Monckton. That gentleman, who had inquired for her immediately after the Harrels went to their villa, and who had flattered himself with reaping much advantage from their absence by frequent meetings and confidential discourses, suffered the severest mortification when he found that her stay in town rendered her not the less inaccessible to him, since he had no personal acquaintance with the Delviles, and could not venture to present himself at their house. He was now received by her with more than usual pleasure. The time had seemed long to her since she had conversed with him, and she was eager to ask his counsel and assistance in her affairs. She related to him the motives which had induced her to go to St. James's Square, and the incorrigible obstinacy with which Mr. Harrel still continued to encourage the addresses of Sir Robert Floyer. She earnestly entreated him to become her agent in a business to which she was unequal, by expostulating in her cause with Mr. Harrel, and by calling upon Sir Robert himself to insist upon his foregoing his unauthorized pretensions. Mr. Monckton listened eagerly to her account and request, and when she had finished, assured her he would deliberate upon each circumstance of the affair, and then maturely weigh every method he could devise to extricate her from an embarrassment which now grew far too serious to be safely neglected. I will not, however, he continued, either act or give my opinion without further inquiry, as I am confident there is a mystery in this business which lies deeper than we can at present fathom. Mr. Harrel has doubtless purposes of his own to answer by this pretended zeal for Sir Robert, nor is it difficult to conjecture what they may be. Friendship in a man of his light cast is a mere cover, a mere name to conceal a connection which has its basis solely in the licentious convenience of borrowing money, going to the same gaming house, and mutually communicating and boasting their mutual vices and intrigues, while all the time their regard for each other is equally hollow with their regard for truth and integrity. He then cautioned her to be extremely careful with respect to any money transactions with Mr. Harrel, whose splendid extravagance he assured her was universally known to exceed his fortune. The countenance of Cecilia during this exhortation was testimony sufficient to the penetrating eyes of Mr. Monckton that his advice came not too soon. A suspicion of the real state of the case speedily occurred to him, and he questioned her minutely upon the subject. She endeavoured to avoid making him any answer, but his discernment was too keen for her inartificial evasion, and he very soon gathered all the particulars of her transactions with Mr. Harrel. He was less alarmed at the sum she had lent him, which was rather within his expectations, than at the method she had been induced to take to procure it. He represented to her in the strongest manner the danger of imposition, nay, of ruin, from the extortions and the craft of moneylenders, and he charged her upon no consideration to be tempted or persuaded again to have recourse to such perilous expedients. She promised the most attentive observance of his advice, and then told him the acquaintance she had made with Miss Belfield, and her sorrow for the situation of her brother. Though satisfied for the present with the plan of young Delvile, she now gave up her design of soliciting his counsel. In the midst of all this conversation, a note was delivered to her from Mr. Delvile senior, acquainting her with his return to town, and begging the favour of her to call in St. James's Square the next morning, as he wished to speak to her upon some business of importance. The eager manner in which Cecilia accepted this invitation, and her repeated and earnest exclamation of wonder at what Mr. Delvile could have to say, passed not unnoticed by Mr. Monckton. He instantly turned the discourse from the Belfields, the Harrels, and the Baronet, to inquire how she had spent her time during her visit to St. James's Square, and what was her opinion of the family after her later opportunities of intimacy. Cecilia answered that she had yet seen nothing more of Mr. Delvile, who had been absent the whole time, but with equal readiness and pleasure she replied to all his questions concerning his lady, expatiating with warmth and fervour upon her many rare and estimable qualities. But when the same interrogatories were transferred to the son, she no longer spoke with the same ease, nor with her usual promptitude of sincerity. She was embarrassed, her answers were short, and she endeavoured to hasten from the subject. Mr. Monckton remarked this change with the most apprehensive quickness, but forcing a smile, "Have you yet," he said. "Observe the family compact in which these people are bound to besiege you, and draw you into their snares." "No, indeed," cried Cecilia, much hurt by the question. "I am sure no such compact has been formed, and I am sure too that if you knew them better, you would yourself be the first to admire and do them justice." "My dear Miss Beverley," cried he, "I know them already. I do not indeed visit them, but I am perfectly acquainted with their characters, which have been drawn to me by those who are most closely connected with them, and who have had opportunities of inspection which I hope will never fall to your share, since I am satisfied the trial would pain, though the proof would convince you." "What then have you heard of them?" cried Cecilia with much earnestness. "It is at least not possible any ill can be said of Mrs Delvile." "I beg your pardon," returned he. "Mrs Delvile is not nearer perfection than the rest of her family. She has only more art in disguising her foibles, because though she is the daughter of pride, she is the slave of interest." "I see you have been greatly misinformed," said Cecilia warmly. "Mrs Delvile is the noblest of women. She may, indeed, from her very exaltation, have enemies, but they are the enemies of envy, not of resentment, enemies raised by superior merit, not excited by injury or provocation." "You will know her better hereafter," said Mr Monckton calmly. "I only hope your knowledge will not be purchased by the sacrifice of your happiness." "And what knowledge of her, sir," cried Cecilia, starting, "can have power to put my happiness in any danger?" "I will tell you," answered he, "with all the openness you have a claim to from my regard, and then leave to time to show if I am mistaken. The Delvile family, notwithstanding its ostentatious magnificence, I can solemnly assure you, is poor in every branch, alike lineal and collateral." "But is it therefore the less estimable?" "Yes, because the more rapacious. And while they count on each side dukes, earls, and barons in the genealogy, the very wealth with which, through your means, they project the support of their insolence, and which they will grasp with all the greediness of avarice, they will think honoured by being employed in their service, while the instrument, all amiable as she is, by which they attain it, will be constantly held down as the disgrace of their alliance." Cecilia, stung to the soul by this speech, rose from her chair, unwilling to answer it, yet unable to conceal how much it shocked her. Mr Monckton, perceiving her emotion, followed her, and taking her hand, said, "I would not give this warning to one I thought too weak to profit from it, but as I am well informed of the use that is meant to be made of your fortune, and the abuse that will follow over yourself, I think it right to prepare you for their artifices, which merely to point out may render abortive." Cecilia, too much disturbed to thank him, drew back her hand and continued silent. Mr Monckton, reading through her displeasure the state of her affections, saw with terror the greatness of the danger which threatened him. He found, however, that the present was no time for enforcing objections, and perceiving he had already gone too far, though he was by no means disposed to recant, he thought it most prudent to retreat, and let her meditate upon his exhortation while its impression was yet strong in her mind. He would now therefore have taken leave, but Cecilia, endeavouring to recollect herself, and fully persuaded that however he had shocked her, he had only her interest in view, stopped him, saying, "You think me perhaps ungrateful, but believe me I am not. I must, however, acknowledge that your censure of Mrs Delvile hurts me extremely. Indeed I cannot doubt her worthiness. I must still therefore plead for her, and I hope a time may come when you will allow I have not pleaded unjustly." "Justly or unjustly," answered Mr Monckton, "I am at least sure you can never plead vainly. I give up, therefore, to your opinion my attack of Mrs Delvile, and am willing from your commendations to suppose her the best of the race. Nay, I will even own that perhaps Mr Delvile himself, as well as his lady, might pass through life and give but little offence, had they only themselves to think of, and no son to stimulate their arrogance." "Is the son, then," said Cecilia faintly, "so much the most culpable?" "The son, I believe," answered he, "is at least the chief incentive to insolence and ostentation in the parents, since it is for his sake they covet with such avidity honours and riches, since they plume themselves upon regarding him as the support of their name and family, and since their pride in him even surpasses their pride in their lineage and themselves." "Ah," thought Cecilia, "and of such a son who could help being proud?" "Their purpose, therefore," he continued, "is to secure through his means your fortune, which they will no sooner obtain than, to my certain knowledge, they mean instantly and most unmercifully to employ it in repairing all their dilapidated estates." And then he quitted the subject, and with that guarded warmth which accompanied all his expressions, told her he would carefully watch for her honour and welfare, and repeating his promise of endeavouring to discover the tie by which Mr. Harrel seemed bound to the baronet, he left her, a prey himself to an anxiety yet more severe than that with which he had filled her. He now saw all his long-cherished hopes in danger of final destruction, and suddenly cast upon the brink of a precipice, where, while he struggled to protect them from falling, his eyes were dazzled by beholding them totter. Meanwhile Cecilia, disturbed from the calm of soft serenity to which she had yielded every avenue of her soul, now looked forward with distrust and uneasiness, even to the completion of the views which but a few minutes before had comprised all her notions of felicity. The alliance which so lately had seemed wholly unexceptionable, now appeared teeming with objections and threatening with difficulties. The representations of Mr. Monckton had cruelly mortified her. Well acquainted with his knowledge of the world, and wholly unsuspicious of his selfish motives, she gave to his assertions involuntary credit, and even while she attempted to combat them, they made upon her mind an impression scarce ever to be erased. Full therefore of doubt and inquietude, she passed the night in discomfort and irresolution, now determining to give way to her feelings, and now to be wholly governed by the counsel of Mr. Monckton. It's a curious one, isn't it, that she should be so much enthralled to Mr. Monckton? It's hard to understand in one so intelligent, and yet I suppose he's been a friend since childhood. She, unlike how he sees her, she sees him completely almost as a father figure, somebody to advise her, who has always looked out for her, and she's completely blind to his real interest. It's quite a shame. But it's also interesting that he is awful, and we hate him, but he isn't. What he does out of self-interest does to an extent protect Cecilia. He is right in his counsel to her about the Harrels, and he is right to support her with Sir Robert, which it just goes to show that people are complicated and situations are also complicated. And on that deeply profound note, let's carry on. Chapter 4. An expectation. In this disposition of mind, Cecilia the next morning obeyed the summons of Mr. Delvile, and for the first time went to St. James's Square in a humour to look for evil instead of good, and meanness instead of nobleness. She was shown into an apartment where she found Mr. Delvile alone, and was received by him as usual with the most stately solemnity. When she was seated, "I have given you, Miss Beverley," said he, "the trouble of calling, in order to discuss with you the internal state of your affairs, a duty which at this juncture I hold to be incumbent upon my character. The delicacy due to your sex would certainly have induced me to wait upon you myself for this purpose, but for the reasons I have already hinted to you, of fearing the people with whom you live might think it necessary to return my visit. Persons of low origin are commonly in those matters the most forward. Not, however, that I would prejudice you against them, though for myself it is fit I remember that a general and indiscriminate acquaintance, by levelling all ranks, does injury to the rights of society." It's basically Dominic Cummings, isn't he? No, not Dominic Cummings. What am I talking about? I mean Rees-Mogg, the guy who lies around in the Commons. Basically him. Ah, thought Cecilia, how infallible is Mr. Monckton! And how inevitably, in a family of which Mr. Delvile is the head, should I be cruelly held down as the disgrace of their alliance. "I have applied," continued he, "to Mrs. Delvile, to know if the communication which I had recommended to you, and to which she had promised her attention, had yet passed. But I am informed you have not spoken to her upon the subject." "I had nothing, sir, to communicate," answered Cecilia, "and I had hoped, as Mrs. Delvile made no inquiries, she was satisfied she had nothing to hear." "With respect to enquiries," said Mr. Delvile, "I fear you are not sufficiently aware of the distance between a lady of Mrs. Delvile's rank, both by birth and alliance, and such a young woman as Mrs. Harrel, whose ancestors but a short time since were mere Suffolk farmers. But I beg your pardon. I mean not any reflection upon yours. I have always heard they were very worthy people. And a farmer is certainly a very respectable person. Your father, I think, no more than the Dean, your uncle, did nothing in that way himself? No, sir, said Cecilia dryly, and much provoked by this contemptuous courtesy. I have always been told he was a very good sort of man. I knew none of the family myself, but the Dean. His connections with the Bishop of my relation, put him often in my way, though his naming me for one of his trustees, I must own, was rather extraordinary. But I mean not to hurt you. On the contrary, I should be much concerned to give you any uneasiness. Again Mr. Monckton arose in the mind of Cecilia, and again she acknowledged the truth of his strictures. And though she much wondered in what a harangue so pompous was to end, her disgust so far conquered her curiosity that without hearing it she wished herself away. To return, said he, to my purpose. The present period of your life is such as to render advice particularly seasonable. I am sorry, therefore, as I before said, you have not disclosed your situation to Mrs. Delvile. A young lady on the point of making an establishment, and with many engagements in her power, is extremely liable to be mistaken in her judgment, and therefore should solicit instruction from those who are able to acquaint her what connection would be most to her advantage. One thing, however, I am happy to commend. The young man who is wounded in the duel, I cannot recollect his name, is, I hear, totally out of the question. What next? Thought Cecilia, though still she gave him no interruption, for the haughtiness of his manner was repulsive to reply. My design, therefore, is to speak to you of Sir Robert Floyer. When I had last the pleasure of addressing you upon this subject, you may probably remember my voice was in his favour, but I then regarded him merely as the rival of an inconsiderable young man, to rescue you from whom he appeared an eligible person. The affair is now altered. That young man is thought of no more, and another rival comes forward, to whom Sir Robert is as inconsiderable as the first rival was to Sir Robert. Cecilia started at this information. Livelier sensations stimulated her curiosity, and surmises in which she was most deeply interested quickened her attention. This rival, proceeded he, I should imagine no young lady would a moment hesitate in electing. He is every way the superior of Sir Robert, except in fortune, and the deficiencies of that the splendour of your own may amply supply. The deepest crimson now tinged the cheeks of Cecilia. The prophecy of Mr. Monckton seemed immediately fulfilling, and she trembled with the rising conflict between her approbation of the offer and her dread of its consequences. I know not, indeed, continued he, in what estimation you may have been accustomed to hold rank and connection, nor whether you are impressed with a proper sense of their superiority and value, for early prejudices are not easily rooted out, and those who have lived chiefly with moneyed people regard even birth itself as unimportant when compared with wealth. The colour which first glowed in the cheeks of Cecilia from expectation now rose yet higher from resentment. She thought herself already insulted by a prelude so ostentatious and humiliating to the proposals which were to follow, and she angrily determined, with whatever pained her heart, to assert her own dignity by refusing them at once, too well satisfied by what she now saw of the present, that Mr. Monckton had been just in his prediction of the future. Your rejection, therefore, continued he, of this honourable offer may perhaps have been merely the consequence of the principles in which you have been educated. Rejection? Interrupted Cecilia, amazed. What rejection, sir? Have you not refused the proposals of my Lord Ernolf for his son? Lord Ernolf? Never, have I ever seen either his lordship or his son but in public." "That," replied Mr. Delvile, "is little to the purpose. Where the connection is a proper one, a young lady of delicacy has only to accede to it. But though this rejection came not immediately from yourself, it had doubtless your concurrence." "It had not, sir, even my knowledge." "Your alliance, then, with Sir Robert Floyer is probably nearer a conclusion than I had imagined, for otherwise Mr. Harrel would not, without consulting you, have given the Earl so determinate an answer." "No, sir," said Cecilia impatiently, "my alliance with him was never more distant, nor do I mean it should ever approach more near." She was now little disposed for further conversation. Her heroic design of refusing young Delvile by no means reconciled her to the discovery she now made that he had not meant to address her; and though she was provoked and fretted at this new proof that Mr. Harrel scrupled neither assertions nor actions to make her engagement with Sir Robert credited, her disappointment in finding that Mr. Delvile, instead of pleading the cause of his son, was exerting his interest for another person, affected her so much more nearly, that notwithstanding he still continued his parading harangue, she scarcely knew even the subject of his discourse, and seized the first opportunity of a cessation to rise and take her leave. He asked her if she would not call upon Mrs. Delvile, but desirous to be alone, she declined the invitation. He then charged her to proceed no further with Sir Robert till he had made some inquiries concerning Lord Ernolf, and graciously promising his protection and counsel, suffered her to depart. Cecilia now perceived she might plan her rejections or study her dignity at her leisure, for neither Mr. Delvile nor his son seemed in any haste to put her fortitude to the proof. With regard therefore to their plots and intentions, Mr. Monckton she found was wrong, but with respect to their conduct and sentiments she had every reason to believe him right; and though her heart refused to rejoice in escaping a trial of its strength, her judgment was so well convinced that his painting was from the life, that she determined to conquer her partiality for young Delvile, since she looked forward to nothing but mortification in a connection with his family. "Oh, Cecilia, why are you listening to Mr. Monckton? Oh, but I mean, Mr. Delvile does make it very hard. Not to think that allying yourself with that family would be a gross mistake. So, I do have some sympathy. Oh, and the Harrels. Oh, don't worry, it's all going to get worse. Maybe before it gets better. Guess we'll have to see. Good night.